Hello, and yes, just want to reiterate Ali's thanking you for choosing to be here on such a beautiful, glorious Sunday afternoon. And I'm going to start by looking at dealing with, as Ali said, the first section with the structural issues, how power has been affected at this sort of structural level, and then later looking at the actual impact on Palestine, how the Palestinian struggle has affected and been affected by the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia and mass mobilization elsewhere in the region. So as we all know, the revolutions and uprisings in the region in many ways caught the US and EU states off guard. The US, as Ali has pointed out, has been a hegemonic power in the region for years, for at least 60 years. And it's since the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia has really been engaged in sort of rhetorical and policy acrobatics in order to, on the one hand, sort of avoid charges of hypocrisy and present the US as staying true to its at least rhetorical support for democratization in the region. A policy that Obama has started under the Bush administration, but supported by Obama and reiterated, most importantly, probably in his 2009 Cairo speech, while at the same time, of course, trying to figure out ways to secure its economic, political, and geostrategic interests in the region. So its strategy so far, as Ali has pointed out, has been a sort of mixture of supporting the status quo forces in the region when and where possible, and in situations where it's deemed, where the strategy is no longer deemed viable, attempting to manage the extent, to the extent possible, the revolutionary processes themselves and or their outcomes. Yet, despite the their best efforts, U.S. hegemonic control over the region is weakening. The revolutions in the region are both a symptom and a cause of this, I think. There are various international, domestic, and regional factors for decline in U.S. power in the region. Strategic losses, for example, in Iraq and Lebanon. Also, there's a shift in the material power in the international system away from the U.S., as well as military power away from the U.S. And all of this has begun to affect U.S. hegemony in the region. And ultimately, I think, of course, these structural changes will have a positive effect on the Palestinian struggle. So I'll begin by considering some of the ramifications of these structural shifts in the region and an international balance of power on Israel and its maneuvering power. And then I'll consider the various ways in the second half of how the revolutions and uprisings have affected and been affected by the Palestinian struggle. So undoubtedly, the aftershock from the political earthquake, regional political earthquake, and the shift in the balance of power it has catalyzed has been felt most probably acutely, we can say, in relation to the Palestinian struggle. Although it goes without saying, the revolutions of Egypt and Tunisia and the popular mobilization and uprisings elsewhere in the region have been focused largely on domestic issues. Many of these structural issues, Ali has already pointed out, both political and economic, including corruption, poverty, political repression, lack of meaningful citizenship, respect for human rights and civil liberties, inequality, unemployment. A lot of this caused by the structural adjustment policies imposed on these states by the IMF and World Bank. Yet, and despite, I think, the best efforts of Western states, and the U.S. in particular, to ignore and or undermine them, international factors and foreign policy has also been the focus of protesters' grievances and demands. And I think it's interesting, I just followed online a CSID conference, the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, a think tank, a DC-based think tank that's relatively close, we could say, with the Obama administration. And there were quite a few U.S. representatives at that conference, government representatives, including Tamara Kaufman-Witt, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and Dennis Ross, who's now the Special Assistant to the President and also a Senior Director in the National Security Council. And essentially, they tried to sort of shift the focus away from international factors, away from the past role of the United States in supporting these dictators that have been overthrown by the regime, especially in the context of the war on terror, the massive amounts of economic and military aid that were given to these states, and of course to keep the focus away from the policies of the Israeli state and the occupation of Palestine and the ramifications, of course, these revolutions would have for the Palestinian struggle. But I think it's important, insofar as they were trying to ignore these issues, I think it's important, even more so important for us to raise these issues and focus on them and look at what the ramifications might be. So as the governments of the neighboring states start to more adequately reflect the will of the populations, of their populations, they'll no doubt prove less amenable to Israeli interests. There'll be a more level playing field, of course, created for the Palestinians, I think, and this will strengthen ultimately the Palestinian hand on many levels. So in the past, we know that Arab regimes have sought to appease the opposition of their states by paying lip service to the Palestinian cause, because they understand that the place that it holds in the Arab psyche. And while the revolutions have revealed that this tactic is no longer sufficient to keep the forces of opposition at bay, I think it's wrong to understand that the new Arab mood is somehow consistent with a friendlier posture towards a country that continues to occupy Palestinian land and dispossess Palestinian people. The most important player in this respect, and we'll have more on this later, so far is Egypt. Of course, a prominent U.S. ally, the first Arab country to sign the peace deal with Israel in 1979, but of course this deal was not signed by a democratic Arab government, but was reached in spite of the strong opposition which persists until today. Under Mubarak, Egypt was instrumental in maintaining 3 outrages from the Palestinian perspective, including the blockade of the Gaza Strip, the division of the Palestinian National Movement, and security collaboration between the PA and Israel on the West Bank. Also, Egypt allowed Israeli bombers to overfly Egyptian territory when Israel attacked Gaza in 2008-2009. There are already signs, though, that the Egyptian government is taking steps to construct its policies in a way that more adequately reflects the will of its people. For example, Egypt's foreign minister has sent a letter recently to the Israeli foreign minister and warned about the consequences of the escalation of military action against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, saying, quote, "as any military action against Gaza will have serious repercussions on the region as a whole." The Egyptian foreign minister has also told the Palestinian leadership that lifting the Israeli-imposed siege of Gaza, supported by the discredited Mubarak regime, is a priority for the new government. It's also discussed renegotiating natural gas deals between the two countries. Also recently, the Egyptian finance minister, Samir Radwan, in discussing the future Israeli investment, potential for future Israeli investment in Egypt, said it didn't need Egypt does not need investments, quote unquote, from the enemy. There's also been there have been several demonstrations, including thousands of Egyptians outside of Israel's embassies in Cairo, as well as its consulate in Alexandria. Perhaps more symbolically, Egypt Airlines recently took Tel Aviv off of its list of destinations that it flies to. What has Israel's response been to all of this? Unfortunately, though perhaps predictably, the first reaction of the Israeli government to the events in Egypt was to adopt a bunker mentality. Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered the construction of the wall on the border between Egypt and Israel, the border with Egypt, its border with Egypt, to be speeded up. There were also calls for the reoccupation of the Philadelphia corridor along Egypt's border with Gaza and Israel. And the Israeli government is seeking to boost military spending and may seek an additional $20 billion in U.S. security assistance to help it manage potential threats stemming from popular upheavals in the Arab world. Ever since signing the Camp David Accords, Israel has pretty much been given a free ride by its Western backers, invading Arab countries and grabbing land at will. Lebanon, of course, was the first example, a victim in 1982. Camp David, in fact, gave such security to Israel that its defense spending dropped from 35% of the national budget in the period before 1978 to between 9 and 15% of the national budget in recent years, roughly $17 billion per year. And of course, U.S. military assistance accounts for about $3 billion of that. So, but now the region has changed and Egypt is returning to its pivotal role, and the Israeli position may be changing as well. Already we see Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak warn last month of a diplomatic tsunami if the stalemate in the Middle East peace talks continues. Prime Minister Netanyahu also said that Israel is considering withdrawing its occupation army out of the West Bank and restarting some sort of peace initiative, new peace initiative. You know, again, this is very similar to what we saw in the case of Mubarak and Ben Ali in Tunisia and Egypt. This sort of a last-minute attempt to appease the population by concessions that are really seen by most people as too little and too late. And also there's, and this has been going on for some time now, I think it was last year, that General David Petraeus in a talk to Congress mentioned that the U.S. asymmetric and unconditional support for Israel is starting to become a sort of burden for U.S. interests in the region. And more recently, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, just last week in a meeting to the U.S. Islamic World Forum, suggested that the situation cannot continue in the same vein. And in general, we could say there's this increasing recognition amongst U.S. policymakers that something needs to change. So the question is now, how have these changes impacted the Palestinian struggle? And I'll just get into this a bit, but then I'll look at strategies of resistance in the second half. But as a recent MIMO, the Middle East Monitoring Organization, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, they have a report recently that argued that to assume the resolve of the Palestinian people is less than their counterparts in other parts of the region is to live in cloud cuckoo land. Like the millions of other disenfranchised Arabs, Palestinians want to be free. They want to be ruled by a government of their own choosing, which represents their will and aspirations. Though many of the structural factors that have led to the revolutions and uprisings elsewhere in the region are shared by the Palestinians, of course they had the added factor to contend with, which is the Israeli occupation. In terms of their economic grievances, according to the latest survey by the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics, some 26.2% of families and Palestinian families live in poverty, with 14.1% living in deep poverty. So that's a total of 40.3% living in poverty or deep poverty in the West Bank and Gaza. The situation in Gaza is worse than the West Bank, it should be pointed out. In addition to the economic and political demands made by the protesters elsewhere in the region, another key demand has been a restoration of the people's dignity. As has been evident in many of the protests, slogans, and posters in the region, the people are calling for karama wa hura, that's free, dignity and freedom. As Rashid Khalidi has argued in a recent article, this component of dignity has two dimensions. I think it's a really good point that he's made. One is concerned with the dignity of the individual, which has been repeatedly violated by the dictators of the region through corruption, violence, and general oppression. And secondly, the dignity of the people, a collective dignity, which has been contemptuously violated not only by their dictators, but also, and perhaps more importantly, by their Western supporters. So how is this collective dignity violated? Every time a Western government approves of military training, cooperation, or weapon sales to a brutal dictator, in the full knowledge that they can and will be used against his own people, they're participating in the violation of the collective dignity of the people of the region. Each time they proclaim to support democracy in the region and then proceed to interfere in democratic processes and or ignore the will of the people, when these processes produce results that are deemed to conflict with their own interests, they are participating in the violation of the collective dignity of the people of the region. Both levels of violation of dignity apply just as much, I think, if not more so, to the Palestinian case as elsewhere in the region. I don't need to go over the list of indignities that Israelis have subjected the Palestinians to over the past 6+ decades, but you know they're characterized by Israel's apartheid policies, its land grab and resource grab in the West Bank and Gaza, illegal settlement construction in the West Bank and Jerusalem, its holding of thousands of Palestinian political prisoners, including hundreds of children, its collective punishment of the people of the open-air prison that is Gaza, for daring to choose a government that's not to Israel and West's liking. And the list goes on. So before I get into, again, as I said and Ali said, looking at the strategies of resistance and also how I think that the situation may impact upon Western, U.S. in particular, and EU policies, I'll pass the floor on.
Thank you.